Good day, mates. My name is Mordecai, and welcome back to the show, where an aspiring role-player narrates various RPG-related stories as a learning tool. I am speaking through my familiar recorder for this narration. Whilst I am yet to formally attempt being a dungeon master for an adventuring party through a world of fantasy, it is worth noting that there are many ways to be an effective dungeon master depending upon what kind of game you want to run. And thus, I anticipate that a game built upon intrigue will be ran very differently from one where all of the information is freely given. It does mean that flexibility in approach is an essential skill to have when approaching a potential variety of tables, especially for the purposes of having fun along with all of the other players, including the Dungeon Master. A potential issue that could occur when engaging with a new Dungeon Master is the difference in expectations of how the game could be ran, especially with regards to how in and out of character knowledge is handled. And the problem this can cause could be made worse if a current Dungeon Master wants to try playing as a player in a game being ran differently to how they run their own game. So just how bad do the problems become in today's story? Let's find out as we embark on another delve. Before we begin with today's story, if you like my content and want to see more, feel free to subscribe and like the video. It's free to do, and every bit of support is highly appreciated. Plus, you can always change your mind at a later date. Let's delve into the often terrifying world of r/RPG horror stories. Today's narrative is titled DM Soft Nerfs Characters Instead of Outright Saying Something Doesn't Work, and is written by user Sturks. To start off, I hadn't gotten to play Dungeons & Dragons with people as a player for a long time, being stuck in one of those forever DM situations. Some of my friends I was DMing for invited me to a game that was being run by another friend they had. I gladly accepted because I wanted to try out an illusion wizard archetype. I joined the Discord the DM was running it on and promptly made my character. It was a campaign that had similar features to Eberron, except dragon shards were called something else. I'll just be calling them dragon shards because they're basically the same functionality. Also, since I am a fellow dungeon master, the topic of fudging rolls came up. Obviously, it's a heavily debated one, but this DM said they never fudge rolls to the party. I drew some skepticism because there is always a point where a good DM will fudge a roll to prevent a TPK that was unintentionally unfun, or some other really important situation that makes a player feel powerful. Later, alone in the chat, this Dungeon Master told me that they do in fact fudge rolls, but they didn't want to tell the party, which would have been fine if it wasn't for the fact that this was the same party that knew I did, but extremely rarely. The DM was saying things like it's due to the inexperience that DMs would need to fudge rolls, or if they were just cheaters in open chats, and that irked me a lot. My character was part of a resistance force against a large conglomerate who has been making the shards out of creatures' souls and mind-controlling them. My character was part of a special forces division and had been learning from the leader of it, an artificer, who would also happen to be the creator of these shards. I get sent with the party on a mission, and we end up fighting some bandits and a large creature that I guess was supposed to last more than one round. The DM gets a taste of some of the cool stuff my wizard can do that they hadn't seen before. I had casted Dragon's Breath on my owl familiar and sent it to obliterate the bandits from overhead, and also used it for scouting very effectively. I also had a spell called Phantasmal Force to put a flaming orb above a creature's head to deal damage over time. After the game, the DM was listening to us talk about the campaign, and I had mentioned how an ooze would really suck for myself because it had blind sight. This is important for later. Anyway, on our next mission we get sent into a forested logging camp. There were a lot of these robotic creatures powered by these shards, but their eyes were green instead of blue like the normal shards. We find out in a bit that it's related to the mind control magic being cast upon them. We managed to get our hands on one of them, and I am finally able to cast Identify on it. I'm guessing the Dungeon Master did not expect this at all, because after reading the spell, they give me possibly the most vague answer imaginable. You cannot tell what spell was cast on it. I think about it for a bit, and since it was a huge plot device, after a little bit of intense discussion amongst the party, I decide to cast Detect Magic on myself so I can tell what school of magic it was. I get told, it's enchantment and necromancy. Then, using the same Detect Magic spell, I check our party member who was also one of these robotic creatures, just not mind controlled. And I find nothing different and that they are exactly the same. After more intense discussion, I was finding it really odd that Identify would give me nothing but Detect Magic would. I came to the conclusion that since there are so many of these mind-controlled crystals, it'd have to be something like a Mind Flayer was in control of it all. The Dungeon Master didn't like me bringing up this creature in conversation, because in his words, let the players be surprised by creatures that powerful. The way I came to that conclusion was because, per rules as written, on Identify it only detects a spell cast on it. If it was a creature ability, I would assume it wouldn't explicitly be a spell, but rather an innate ability. Me drawing that conclusion using a good few spells didn't make the Dungeon Master very happy. Oh, also, I could use Wristwatch to send it to another plane and return it, and the eyes would turn blue instead of the mind-controlled green, which gave some more credit to my theory. However, I still wasn't very happy that my Identify spell, which I had used 100 gold for, did absolutely nothing. After much more fiddling through multiple sessions, I gave up because what was likely going to happen was we were going to have to take these crystals to the leader of the Resistance to get looked at and progress the story. There was no way a character was going to be able to figure out anything because plot convenience. I didn't like this a whole lot either, and felt it was very frustrating. Let's take a small break from the narration for a moment. There is a lot of early friction from how differently the original poster runs their games compared to how the DM runs theirs. This DM is going down the route of intrigue, presenting a puzzle with several important elements hiding in plain sight. However, our brave poster dismissed one of the puzzle elements as being nothing, instead of the possibly useful clue that it was. What is curious, however, is that our poster didn't cast Identify on the fellow party member to find out if it was the same kind of magical effect, or an entirely different one altogether. Another aspect to consider is that the poster immediately used metagaming knowledge to fill in the gaps in the puzzle, before doing any actual experimentation or in-character knowledge rolls to find out more information, much to both the Dungeon Master's and my own dismay. Let's resume with the narration to see what happens next. The next session rolls around. We manage to sneak into a large auditorium-like area with tons of enemy mercenaries and a large campsite in the middle for some important mumbo-jumbo going on. The party is in disguise, and I'm some fake, super important rich investor in the evil conglomerate for the operation. We manage to enter the main tent, and we find it's much bigger on the inside than the outside. There's a meeting happening about destroying the local fae. I forget the super detailed bits because I was already kinda stressed potentially being put on the spot by being asked something. Wouldn't you know it though, that's what happened. The leader of the operation, a hulking robotic gnome, was asking me about my thoughts on the situation. I couldn't spit out anything because I didn't want to get the whole party killed. The DM, however, didn't give me a lot of time to think about what I wanted to say. He carried it as though as if it were a normal conversation. When I didn't answer for a few seconds, he continued to prompt me. I made it clear I was talking outside of the game and said that this didn't feel very fun and I wanted some time to think about what it was I had to say. The DM ignored this and continued until I gave a short answer. The game ended, and I brought up this part of the session being very unfun, and the Dungeon Master snapped at me saying, "This is just how I DM, and if you don't like it, then you can leave. The only reason you were invited to the game in the first place was because our mutual friend had asked if you could play." At this point, I was sobbing. Thankfully, there was another player there who was able to hear that I was sobbing, but they didn't say anything though. The conversation just went to another thing until it got brought up again, and I was saying I should leave then. The Dungeon Master then apologized and things seemed slightly better for the time being. The next session, however, we entered the forest to find the Fae and alert them to what was going on. Wouldn't you know it, though, there were oozes. Wow, I never would have expected a creature I brought up being really bad to fight against being used against me. How coincidental! We were on horseback and I casted Dragon's Breath on a fellow party member, and that made short work on the oozes, at least. The Dungeon Master swears that they did not use them because of that, but they also go on about how they were making stuff up as we go because they don't think that far ahead, which leads me to believe it's very unlikely it was coincidental. The next battle inside the forest though was very similar, a giant robot crab that had blind sight, making my illusions useless again. Blind sight back to back felt bad. We dispatched it with effort though. After meeting with the Fae, we had to decide how we were going to return since we were in the forest. The party wanted to go one way and I another, so we decided to split up. I was fairly confident though, since there were Fae with me that could fight if need be. The next and final session I played in, the Fae and I were trekking through the forest just fine. Then the DM rolls for encounter, and it's some creature that can telepathically talk to me whilst being hidden. My DM experience tells me that this is a mean lock, but I don't say anything about it because it'd ruin the fun and use my character in a way that would be acceptable for them to act. I basically prepare them for an ambush since it knew they were being followed. My wizard had an insane passive perception of 23, and being prepared for battle, I assumed meant I couldn't be surprised by an ambush. The Dungeon Master thought differently and decided my character would be surprised, even though it was well aware an ambush would happen. Basically, they used this to prevent me from casting Shield, but once I was hit, the Dungeon Master was saying they could tell I was hurt, so they would all go after me only. Very cool, I guess. I used Shield with almost every single reaction I could, and again Dragon Breath them to death since they could teleport right on top of me. Oh, also, the Fear Aura these ones had only allowed me to roll a single time, every time they were within range of me for it, and not every turn. The way the Dungeon Master handled Fear was fight or flight. If you run away, you can't take attack actions against a creature, but if you fight, you have to use your action to deal damage or cast spells, which also meant I couldn't disengage. I learned this after choosing my actions for each turn. So I basically couldn't move for the entirety of the fight from one failed roll. I killed them with effort, but it didn't feel that great since I still had very little choice in how I could deal with them anyway. Between sessions, there was a discussion about what spells I'd take once I leveled. I was talking about cool spells like casting Haste on our rogue, using Tiny Hut or other stuff. Once I brought up Tiny Hut though, the DM was adamant that it didn't have a flaw because otherwise it wouldn't be very interactable. The discussion gets intense again because, as I already know, a good Dungeon Master will have creatures smart enough to ambush players once Tiny Hut runs out, or prepare attacks. I was explaining that I didn't understand how Tiny Hut could be considered a warm and dry place without some kind of flaw to it. After a bit of back and forth, I threw in the towel. I figured this was a sign of things to come, and things that have already happened as well. I have to give it to the DM, at least they didn't just straight up say, "The creature knows your spell is an illusion because X," even if it would have saved me from putting in more effort into something I wasn't going to get anything out of. I can only assume after leaving my character was pronounced dead, even though it fought off those creatures, just to make it easy for them. I still haven't told the other players what the DM was telling me about the fudging rolls or other things behind the screen because I want them to be happy playing if they can be. I think knowing this really soured the game for me, but not because it was happening, just that I had to keep it a secret whilst knowing, and being thrown under the bus for it. This story is definitely not as bad as others I've seen on here, I feel like. But I wanted to put it someplace because it annoys me even to this day. In summary, a Dungeon Master makes life miserable, but doesn't blatantly nerf spells into oblivion. Too much coincidental stuff to prevent imaginative gameplay paying off. I got tired of it and left because the soft railroading and feeling like my character choices didn't matter. And that's where the story ends. This story does have a lot to offer in terms of analysis. Firstly, since there is an inherent need to be flexible as both a Dungeon Master and or as a player, there are going to be a wide variety of potential forms of play whilst at the table, depending on what kind of game is being ran. And that possible variety is what can keep tabletop role-playing exciting from table to table. Regardless of whether dice rolls are being fudged to keep the players on their toes but still alive in a pinch, or if you roll in the open to reveal that the monster the party is fighting has some form of legendary resistance. And which approach should be used depends entirely on the Dungeon Master. Which also means I have to point out that I suspect that the poster was trying to undermine how the Dungeon Master was running their game. To further add to this, the poster ignored puzzle elements when they were being presented, instead opting to metagame their way to a solution by figuring out that the big bad was an illithid, more commonly referred to as a mind flayer. And just because you as the player have already worked out that there is an illithid behind the current plot's machinations, that doesn't mean that the character you are playing also knows who or what is involved. Perhaps this confusion arises from how differently the poster and the Dungeon Master run their respective games. However, this issue could have been avoided with a Session 0 to find out how the game was being ran and what is expected of players, especially when one of them is a veteran Dungeon Master. Another constant issue with the game from the poster's perspective is the differences in how the spells were being ran. To keep it brief, having the Identify spell get resisted by an effect or a more powerful spell is a great way to build intrigue, to add in a puzzle element, or even an opportunity for roleplay and discussion with the party. And unfortunately, very little of that actually ended up happening, since the poster dismissed the results of the Identify spell as being nothing. This also feeds into the perception of the character being soft-nerfed, and there being no real meaning to character decisions, in a game where they ignored the potential plot hook to pursue some other goals altogether, whilst feeling like character choices didn't matter, and even causing the party to split towards the end through their choices. Moving on. An additional issue to discuss is the possibility that the Dungeon Master was using in-game mechanics to punish the poster's bad behavior of metagaming. On one hand, you could argue that having oozes and other creatures with blind sight stack up against the illusion wizard could create potential roleplay or dynamic story elements. And on the other hand, gaining surprise on a wizard when that surprise ambush was heavily telegraphed can be easily interpreted as a jerk move to try and punish the particular player. It would have been far more preferable to talk to the problem player outside of the game to try and rein in their bad behaviour before it got out of hand. At this point, if someone were to ask me if anyone in this particular story was a jerk, my answer would have to be that both the poster and the DM are jerks up to a point. Sort of. Stick an asterisk on the end of that sentence. Especially considering how the poster was more than a little presumptuous about what makes a good dungeon master. Because whilst you can absolutely have appalling dungeon masters that suck the fun out of the game for everyone at the table, this isn't necessarily one of those situations where it's clear cut. I don't think a difference of opinion on how the game should be ran is a good metric for determining if a dungeon master is good or bad. And as an aspiring roleplayer who may someday be a dungeon master themselves, even if part-time or as a one-off, these are all aspects to consider when I approach the DM screen. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed my content and would like to see more, feel free to subscribe and give the video a like. It's free to do, and every bit of support is highly appreciated. Plus, you can always change your mind at a later date. Thank you again for watching, and I shall see you all next time.